At first glance, it looked like nothing unusual was about to happen, just another episode in a familiar format where two fighters sit across from each other, speak calmly, answer questions, and maintain a level of respect that keeps everything controlled and predictable. But sometimes the most interesting moments aren't the loud ones, they're the quiet ones, the ones where tension exists beneath the surface without ever fully revealing itself, and that's exactly what made this particular gloves-off episode between Jaron Ennis and Xander Zayas feel different from the very beginning, because even before the conversation really started, there was a subtle energy in the room, something that didn't come from words, but from presence, from the awareness that both fighters understood what this moment represented, not just as a media appearance, but as a step closer to something bigger. Jaron Ennis carried himself with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be announced, the type that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and what you're capable of, and throughout his career, that confidence has been one of his defining traits, not loud or exaggerated, but steady and consistent, making it difficult for opponents to read or disrupt. And as he sat there, listening carefully, responding when needed, there was a sense that he wasn't just participating in the conversation, he was observing it, analyzing it, taking in details that most people in the room wouldn't even notice, because for fighters at this level, every interaction can be part of a larger mental game. On the other side, Xander Zayas brought a different kind of presence, one that combined youth, ambition, and a clear desire to prove himself at the highest level. And while he showed respect, as expected in this kind of setting, there was also an underlying determination that came through in subtle ways, in the way he spoke, in the way he held eye contact, and in the way he responded to certain questions, because for him, moments like this aren't just about conversation, they're about positioning, about showing that he belongs in the same space as someone who is already more established, and that balance between respect and ambition created a dynamic that was more complex than it appeared on the surface. As the conversation began, everything followed the expected pattern, with both fighters answering questions thoughtfully, avoiding anything that might turn the moment into unnecessary conflict, and maintaining a tone that felt professional and controlled. But within that structure, there were small details that started to stand out, moments where responses felt slightly more deliberate, pauses that lasted just a bit longer than usual, and shifts in body language that hinted at something deeper. And while none of these moments were obvious on their own, together they created a sense that this wasn't just a routine exchange. One of the most interesting aspects of the interaction was how both fighters managed to communicate without saying certain things directly, using tone, phrasing, and timing to express ideas that went beyond the literal meaning of their words. And this is where the psychological element of boxing becomes visible even outside the ring, because fighters are constantly measuring each other, looking for small advantages, testing reactions, and establishing presence, even in conversations that appear calm on the surface, and in this case, that process was happening in a way that required careful attention to fully understand. As the conversation progressed, there was a subtle shift that most viewers wouldn't immediately notice unless they were paying very close attention, because nothing dramatic actually happened on the surface, no raised voices, no direct insults, no obvious confrontation, and yet the energy between Ennis and Zayas began to feel different, heavier, more focused, as if both fighters had moved past the public version of themselves and into something more real, something more competitive, and it was in these moments that the tone of their answers started to carry a different kind of weight, where even simple statements felt layered with meaning, almost like each word was being chosen not just to respond, but to send a message. What made this shift even more interesting was how controlled it remained, because neither fighter allowed the moment to fully escalate, yet at the same time, neither of them backed away from it either, creating a situation where tension existed without release, building slowly instead of exploding. And this kind of controlled intensity can often be more powerful than open conflict, because it forces both individuals to stay mentally engaged, constantly aware of what the other is saying and how it's being said, and in that environment, even the smallest detail can take on significance, from the way a sentence is delivered to the way eye contact is held just a second longer than expected. There was a point in the conversation where a seemingly simple question about future plans created one of the most revealing moments of the entire episode, because instead of giving a generic answer, both fighters approached it in a way that subtly acknowledged each other without directly saying it, and that's where the underlying tension became impossible to ignore. Because even without mentioning names, it was clear that they were thinking about the same thing, the same possibility, the same potential clash that could eventually move from conversation to reality. And in that moment, the calm tone of the discussion contrasted sharply with the intensity of what was actually being implied. Ennis, known for his composure, maintained his usual calm demeanor, but there was a noticeable sharpness in the way he responded, a slight change in rhythm, a more deliberate choice of words, as if he was carefully balancing respect with confidence, making it clear that while he acknowledged Zayas, he didn't see himself as being on the same level, at least not yet. And that subtle distinction is where psychological battles often begin, not in direct statements, but in the space between what is said and what is implied, and for viewers who understand the sport beyond the surface, that moment carried far more meaning than any obvious confrontation could have. Zayas, on the other hand, didn't shy away from that implied challenge, even though it was never directly stated, and his response reflected a different kind of confidence, one that comes from ambition rather than established dominance, and that difference created a quiet but undeniable contrast between the two, because while Ennis spoke from a position of proven ability, Zayas spoke from a position of belief in what he could become, and when those two mindsets meet, even in a calm setting, they create tension that doesn't need to be loud to be real. As the episode continued, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just a conversation anymore, but a form of psychological positioning, where both fighters were subtly defining how they saw themselves in relation to each other, and that process was happening in real time, through tone, body language, and the structure of their responses, creating a dynamic that felt more like a silent negotiation than a casual interview, and for those watching closely, it raised an important question. Was this moment simply part of promotion? Or was it revealing something genuine about how these two fighters truly viewed each other? One of the most striking aspects of this interaction was how much was being communicated without direct confrontation, because in many ways, silence and restraint can reveal more than aggression, and both Ennis and Zayas seemed fully aware of that, choosing their words carefully, avoiding anything that might break the controlled atmosphere, while still allowing enough meaning to pass through for the tension to remain present. And this balance is extremely difficult to maintain, especially in a setting where cameras are capturing every detail, yet both fighters managed to do it in a way that made the entire exchange feel layered and intentional. There were also moments where the conversation briefly returned to a more relaxed tone, almost as if both fighters were intentionally stepping back from the intensity to keep the situation from escalating too far, but even in those moments, the underlying tension didn't disappear, it simply faded into the background, waiting for the next opportunity to surface again, and that constant shift between calm and intensity created a rhythm that made the entire episode feel unpredictable, even though nothing overtly dramatic was happening. What made this even more compelling was the awareness that both fighters understood the significance of this moment beyond the immediate conversation, because appearances like this aren't just about the present, they're about setting the stage for what could happen in the future, and every word, every reaction, every subtle exchange contributes to that larger narrative, shaping how fans, analysts, and even the fighters themselves perceive the possibility of a future matchup. As the discussion moved closer to its conclusion, there was a noticeable shift in energy once again, not toward escalation, but toward something more reflective, as if both fighters were aware that the moment was coming to an end, and with that awareness came a final opportunity to leave an impression, not through dramatic statements, but through the way they carried themselves in those last few minutes, maintaining composure while still holding on to the quiet intensity that had defined the entire interaction. And it's in moments like these that the true nature of competition becomes visible, not through obvious conflict, but through subtle signals that reveal how individuals see themselves in each other, because long before fighters step into the ring, they begin competing in ways that are less visible but just as important, testing confidence, measuring presence, and establishing psychological ground that can carry over into the fight itself. For viewers who were expecting drama in the traditional sense, this episode may have seemed calm, even uneventful at times, but for those who understood what they were watching, it was something far more complex, a slow-building interaction where tension existed beneath the surface, creating a sense of anticipation that didn't rely on loud moments or direct confrontation. And that's what made it so effective, because instead of giving the audience everything up front, it required attention, interpretation, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious, turning a simple conversation into something that felt layered and meaningful. By the time the episode ended, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final moment of conflict, but there was something else. A sense that something had been established, something that could continue to develop over time, whether through future interactions, future fights, or simply through the ongoing narrative that connects fighters in the public eye. Because in the end, the most powerful moments in boxing aren't always the ones filled with noise and action, sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones where nothing obvious happens, yet everything changes beneath the surface, and this Gloves Off episode was exactly that kind of moment, a controlled conversation that carried just enough tension to suggest that if these two fighters ever do meet in the ring, the fight won't just be physical. It will be personal, psychological, and built on everything that was said, and everything that wasn't.